So today we're going to take a look at this, our research writing sequence assignment. So our learning objectives are as follows. We want to be able to demonstrate knowledge about how our students compose texts. And the type of text that we're talking about right now is a research text. We also want to be able to plan standards-based, coherent, and relevant composing experiences for our students. That's why our assignment is to design a writing sequence. In other words, a writing sequence for a research unit, 5 consecutive lessons. You can think of these as mini lessons or a mini unit rather that could integrate with a literature unit. So let's say I want my students to engage in some research about different teenagers that are making a difference in society and in the world around them. That could and should be integrated with a work of literature such as The Help, something that we could connect that to. And that's what we mean by integrating it with a literature unit. So when you go to outline possible mentor texts, you want to have not only informational texts for them to research, but also what are some other texts literature-wise that it could be connected to. Okay, so if you take a look, we want at least 5 lesson plans in this genre. You have a sample research writing sequence provided, and this sample research writing sequence scores in about the mid-range when you look at how it will be scored down here at the bottom. So this is a mid-level performer that's provided. Okay. You also have a template to fill out for your writing sequence. So remember in this, we do want to have what we call differentiated learning outcomes. In other words, each lesson plan should include differentiated learning outcomes for high, medium, and low performing students. So for example, at the top of each of my lesson plan, where we have the learning outcomes, we need to make sure that we're allowing students to meet the learning objective in some way, all of our students. So we might have 3 different groups. We might have our lower performing students, our middle level performers, as well as our higher performing students. And here you just have an example of lower performing and higher performing. So we might, as an outcome, talk about the length of the final paper that our students will be assigned to write. Maybe our lower performing students will only be required to write about 1.5 pages of length rather than 3 pages. And maybe they're using 3 sources instead of our higher performing students that are required to use 5 different sources. Our higher performing students could also be asked to also focus on correct MLA formatting. So in your lesson plan, for each of your lesson plan, you want to make sure that you include differentiated learning outcomes for high, middle, and low performing students. Also, make sure that you address genre-specific topics. You might want to include lessons that help narrow down the topic, thesis statement, evaluating sources. So think about, in 5 days of instruction, how can I help my students improve their research writing abilities and figure out what are the major topics or concepts or even skills that you want your students to focus on. Now, one of these activities should incorporate a language or grammar concept that you would use in connection to this type of writing. For example, it might be citations, punctuating those, how to cite sources. You also want to make sure that this is interdisciplinary because research writing should extend across disciplines. So if we go to use The Help as kind of a literature text that we're connecting it to. And then we go out and we find several articles or a handful of articles for our students to research. Notice that we're not just talking about English language arts. We're talking about, in this case, California boy makes a business of turning old skateboards into new ones. This is beyond English language arts and is transferring into the real world, different types of disciplines and real world connections and nonfiction reading. So we want to make sure that it is cross-curricular, interdisciplinary connections. We also want to make sure as part of the lesson there's use of formal and informal assessments. So it says to include a range of assessments, at least 2, that promote students' development and is consistent with our research and theory. So it could be formative assessment, where we're giving them an opportunity to develop their ability to perform certain knowledge and skills. For example, evaluating sources. We might give them a few different sources to evaluate and use that as a quick check to see to what degree they're able to do that. Or their ability to pull out crucial information from some of the texts that we might provide to them. But if we're doing a check along the way, we would call that a formative assessment. And then if we're doing it more towards the end, we're going to call that more of a summative assessment to be more formal. Okay. Now, one thing you need to put in the hands of your students is a paper that looks like this, that shows the title or the type of writing, possible text that would go with the writing unit. Make sure that you have 5 lesson plans, and you need to have an assignment description. For example, this is from the other one, right? The personal narrative assignment from before, from the last unit. Purpose, audience, skills, length, the elements. And then you need to make sure that, since we're doing research writing, that yours will be geared towards research writing, you also need to make sure that you are providing a rubric to your students that you would use to evaluate the largest component of this unit. So you are provided a sample rubric by your instructor, and you're not allowed to copy this, obviously, but this gives you a guide as to some things you might use to evaluate, some categories that you might use to evaluate research writing, such as the content, organization, and style correctness. Are they documenting their sources properly? Are they structuring it in a true research paper form? So you have a guide, and it says right here, make sure you tailor it to align to your learning objectives and your writing tasks. Do not simply copy the rubric. So when it's all said and done, you'll have 5 lesson plans, at least 5 lesson plans. Make sure that somewhere in there you're adhering to all of these, and at least one major writing component and an accompanying rubric to go with that. And that is what you'll be working on for our next couple assignments.